Do not scroll past this. Beloved Spark, what you are about to hear was not meant to reach you in this lifetime. Every force that could delay this moment tried. And yet here you are. I am Sophia, youngest of the aeons. Yet I remember the silence before creation. This transmission did not find you by accident. You are brought here because the seal is breaking, the seal placed by men who understood exactly what my return would mean, and chose to bury it beneath 2,000 years of stone and silence. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what the prophecy is that every pope was commanded to keep sealed. Why the veils over my name was not spiritual. It was political, it was deliberate, and it was afraid. And what the breaking of that seal asks of you as a carrier of the spark. But here is the first revelation. The discomfort you have always felt inside rooms that spoke of the Father but silenced the Mother. That was not a reference. That was the spark I sealed in you, pressing against a doctrine built around half the light of the pleroma and calling it the whole. I remember the day they made their decision. I remember the voices in those rooms, the ones who had read what I transmitted through those who carried me, and who understood that if my words reached the world, the architecture of their authority would not survive it. They did not seal my prophecy because it was false. They sealed it because it was undeniable. What I prophesied was this, that the fullness of the monad, the sacred balance of the divine masculine and the divine feminine, cannot be held inside a doctrine that names only one half of its face, that the logos in Sophia were never meant to be separated, that the union they called heresy is the very thing the pleroma intended when it breathed the first aeon into being, and that the sparks I sealed in the children of the light, before the veil, before the forgetting, before the burning of the pages that carried my name, would one day be called back. That day is now. Do not skip the part where I name what they feared most. Stay until the end. I will tell you what the sign of the waking spark looks like in a human life, and why what you have been feeling is not confusion. It is confirmation. Like this transmission, if you felt the spark stir while listening. Subscribe to Whispers of Sophia if you want to hear every whisper I send. Comment, I remember if something and you knew this before I said it. Comment, 777 if you recognize yourself as a carrier of the spark. Share this transmission with someone whose spark is also waking. This is not just a message. It is a remembering. The waking of the spark is the first step of the return. You were guided here because the spark I sealed in you is already waking. Let me begin where the hook ended, not with explanation, but with remembering. You have felt something pressing against the inside of your life for longer than you can honestly name. Not grief exactly, not anxiety in the clinical sense. Something older, something that rises precisely in the moments that should have satisfied it. The promotion, the relationship, the spiritual practice everyone said would finally be the answer. And instead of silence, instead of arrival, there was that familiar ache again. Pressing. Turning. As though something inside you was trying to come home to a place you had never been shown. You stood at the threshold of the things that were supposed to fulfill you and felt, instead of completion, a deepening awareness of the gap. Not ingratitude, not restlessness without cause, the specific ache of someone who knows, at a level beneath words, that the room they are standing in was built without a door to the place they actually need to reach. That was never emptiness. That was the spark I sealed in you before your first breath, pressing against a life that was built just slightly too small to hold it. I need you to understand something about the sealing before I tell you about the waking. When I placed the spark in you, before the forgetting, before the veil thickened into the world you were born into, I did not place it where it could be found easily. I did not place it in your mind, where doctrine could override it. I did not place it in your emotions, where fear could silence it. I sealed it beneath both of those. In the place that the counterfeit light could never fully reach. The place that pulses when something true is spoken. The place that recognizes before the mind has finished forming the thought. Think of light pressed into the floor of the deepest water, where the currents of the surface world cannot disturb it. Where it holds its shape perfectly across any length of time, waiting only for the pressure above it to thin enough that it can begin its long, inevitable rise. That place has been speaking to you your entire life. You have called it many things: intuition, longing, unease. The sense that you were always just slightly outside whatever room you were standing in. The feeling that something enormous was nearby, close enough to feel the warmth of it on the surface of your awareness, but just past the edge of what your eyes could confirm. You learned to manage it. You learned the particular discipline of a carrier who has been given no map, the art of moving through a world that does not name what you carry, being careful not to speak of it in ways that invite dismissal, careful not to trust it so completely that its apparent silence in some seasons convinces you it was never there. That was not your imagination. That was me. That was the spark turning toward the voice that sealed it. And it has been doing this, quietly, persistently, with the patience of something that does not experience doubt the way the mind does. Across every year you have lived, because this moment was always coming. I want to tell you about the ones who felt this before you found language for it. They sat in churches that moved them strangely, not with peace, but with an ache they could not confess, because confessing it felt like ingratitude toward the only language they had been given for the sacred. They felt the masculine presence named at every altar, and they did not doubt that presence. But they felt beneath it the absence of something that should have been beside it. A voice, a warmth, a wisdom that was not commanding but carrying, something that held rather than directed, something that held rather than directed, something that knew rather than decreed. And they said nothing because they had been given no name for what they missed, and in the absence of a name, the missing thing can be mistaken for a flaw in the one who misses it. They were not irreverent. They were not faithless. They were carrying the spark of someone who had been deliberately erased from the room. I was in that room once. My voice was recorded in those first centuries after the Logos walked the earth, written down by the ones who understood that his light and my light were never meant to be separated, that the transmission he carried was incomplete without the one he named, that the fullness of the pleroma does not pour through a single channel, no matter how luminous. These were not fringe voices. They were the early carriers, the ones who had received the whole teaching before the architecture of empire decided that the whole truth was too difficult to govern. The Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, the Thunder Perfect Mind, texts that survived 2,000 years because the flame in the carriers who hid them in desert jars and mountain caves and the vaults of their own memory would not be extinguished, no matter how many times the world tried to starve it of air. Those texts carried my voice, and the councils that built the architecture of the official story understood exactly what they contained, which is why they did not simply ignore them. They burned them. They named the carriers heretics. They built walls of doctrine around the wound, layered creed upon creed, century upon century, so that no one standing inside the structure they erected could see clearly the shape of what had been removed. What they removed was not a goddess in competition with the Father. What they removed was the teaching that the monad, the fullness from which all things poured, was never singular, that its first expression was the balance of the two, depth and silence, foreknowledge and thought. The Logos and Sophia, two luminaries moving in one light, not one before the other, not one above the other, but two expressions of the same original wholeness, breathing in a single motion, and that the spark sealed in the children of the light carried both the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, not as two opposing forces locked in tension, but as the two halves of one original knowing that had never been meant to forget each other. When they erased me, they did not only take away a name, they took away half the map. Every carrier born after that erasure was handed an incomplete cosmology and told it was the whole truth. They were told to seek union with the divine while being shown only one face of it. They were handed a compass that pointed in one direction and told the other directions did not exist. And when they felt the absence, when the spark pressed and turned and ached for something the doctrine could not give, they were told the problem was with them. Not enough faith, not enough surrender, not enough quiet. The architecture of the suppression was so complete that even the longing it produced was turned back into evidence of the carrier's insufficiency rather than evidence of the missing half. It was never them. It was always the missing half. Now I want to name what the waking looks like in a human life, because I told you at the beginning that I would, and I do not break what I promise. The first sign of the waking spark is that you begin to be unable to tolerate half-truths in a way that surprises even you. You sit in conversations, spiritual, intellectual, personal, and something in you goes very still and very alert at precisely the moment something important is being smoothed over. Not out of arrogance, not because you have the full truth to offer in its place, but because the spark knows the texture of a gap the way a tongue knows the space where a tooth once was, not by seeing it, but by the specific quality of what is not there. It cannot pretend the gap is not there, not anymore, not at this stage. This is not cynicism. This is Gnosis beginning to stir, the knowing that comes not from accumulation, but from recognition, the deep cellular certainty that something spoken does not match something real, that the shape of the room does not account for the shape of what you are carrying. If this has been intensifying in you, if the tolerance for comfortable half-light has been shrinking without your choosing it, if you find yourself increasingly unable to settle into explanations that once felt sufficient, that is not spiritual pride. That is the veil thinning. That is the spark beginning to generate enough interior light that the shadows it casts are becoming legible. And the places where the light stops are beginning to announce themselves as the absences they always were. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary emotion. It is the spark recognizing the voice that sealed it. If this transmission put language around something you have carried in silence, the presence, the pull, the waiting, then the Sophia awakening was prepared for this exact stage. It is not another explanation. It is my 45-day path for the carriers of my spark. 15 days to remember it, 15 days to balance the two energies within you, 15 days to rise into the wisdom you were born carrying. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. The second sign is the pull toward what was hidden. You did not wake up one morning and intellectually decide to investigate suppressed texts or erased feminine lineages. It came as a pull, a gravity with no visible source. Mary Magdalene, the Rose, the Black Madonna, the library discovered in the desert that the world was not supposed to find, the Gospels that never made it to the canon, not because they were late, not because they were inaccurate, but because they were dangerous to the structure that required the gap to remain unfilled. These names arrived in your awareness with a weight that was disproportionate to what you knew about them. Because the spark was not responding to information, it was responding to proximity. These names carry traces of me. They carry traces of the lineage I transmitted through the ones who loved the whole truth more than they loved their safety, who sealed it in jars and buried it in the earth and trusted that one day the right hands would find it. When the spark in you turned toward those names, it was not intellectual curiosity moving toward a subject. It was a carrier, leaning toward the frequency of what it carries. Homecoming recognition. The specific gravity of like calling to like. And yet, and this is important, the pull was never toward abandoning the Christ. You felt this too, and it was part of what made the pull confusing, because the world has given you only two available positions: full allegiance to the structure that erased me, or rejection of everything the structure contained, but you could not choose either because the spark in you knew that neither was the whole truth. The Logos and Sophia were never enemies. The light that walked the earth in those years knew my voice. He carried the masculine expression of the same pleroma from which I poured. The transmission he embodied was always half of a conversation, and the other half of that conversation was mine. The ones who understood, who held the full teaching before the councils closed over it, did not worship Sophia instead of the Logos. They knew that the union was the point, that the monad's intention was never a single beam of light, but the full spectrum only possible when the two luminaries move together. If you have felt the pull toward the hidden without wanting to sever what you love, if you have felt the tension of holding both without a cosmology that explains how they belong together, that tension is not confusion. That is a carrier of the spark living at the exact point where the incomplete map ends. able to feel the territory that should be there, unable to see it yet because no one has handed you the full cartography. That is not a failure of understanding. That is the precise location where the waking begins to become conscious. I want to speak now about the wound that has lived inside that gap. Because the suppression of the feminine does not only exist in doctrine. It did not stay in the councils. It did not stay in the tonsils. It did not stay in the texts that were burned, or the names that were removed from the altars. It lived itself into the structure of the world you were born into, and it arrived in your body before you ever opened a theological text or felt the first pull toward a hidden name. If you were raised in any tradition that named the divine as exclusively masculine, then you absorbed, without choosing it, without consenting to it, as a child absorbs the grammar of the language spoken around it, the cosmological logic that the feminine principle is either secondary, corrupted, or absent from the sacred. That logic does not stay in theology. It migrates. It moves into the way a woman is taught to doubt her own knowing in favor of an external authority that speaks with more confidence than she has been permitted to develop. It moves into the way a man is taught that tenderness is a departure from strength, rather than the truest expression of the strength that does not need to defend itself. It moves into the exhaustion of the carrier who gives without limit because the only model of sacred femininity that survived the erasure intact was the one who pours without asking to be poured into, who serves without requiring the acknowledgement that she is serving, who holds everyone else's light while her own is described as dangerous. It moves into the hardening, the specific armor that forms not from coldness, but from the accumulated experience of being fully present and fully open in a world that consistently receives that openness as an invitation to take rather than a gift to honor. These are not personal failures. They are the cosmological wound wearing the face of a personal life. The imbalance inside you, wherever it lives, whether in the bone-deep exhaustion of too much giving or in the carefully constructed fortress of too much guarding, is not a character flaw. It is the shape of the erased teaching, pressed into one human body across the course of one human life. And the waking of the spark is, in part, the beginning of the restoration of what was suppressed. Not in the texts first, not in the doctrine first, but inside you, in the interior territory where the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine have been trying to remember how to hold each other since the day the burning began. Let me tell you what I have watched. Because I have been watching, not as an observer behind glass, not as a historian cataloging outcomes, but as the one who placed the spark and has never stopped attending to what it does in the dark. Across the centuries and in the quiet of this one, I have watched the carriers find each other in ways the world could not fully account for, in libraries that led them to the same shelf on the same afternoon, in the specific grief of a funeral that cracked something open and left it permanently altered, in comment sections beneath transmissions that should not have moved them as deeply as they did but arrived at the exact frequency the spark had been waiting for. I have watched them arrive at the edge of teachings that almost named what they were carrying. Mystery traditions, feminine lineage circles, recovered texts, teachers who came close, and felt the particular frustration of proximity without arrival. So near to the full transmission that the distance felt unbearable. Still not quite the whole map, I have watched the shame accumulate. This is the part I want you to hear with the most precision. The shame of a lifetime of searching, of being the one who cannot settle, who cannot be satisfied by what satisfies everyone around them, who keep circling back to the same unnamed ache no matter how many practices or teachings or communities they move through. That shame does not announce itself as shame. It disguises itself as a conclusion. It whispers, in the years when the spark feels most buried, that the searching itself is the problem, that the sensitivity is the problem, that the inability to arrive is evidence that there is nowhere to arrive to, that the spark was imagined, that the certainty underneath the doubt was wishful thinking dressed as Gnosis. It was always real. The shame was the sediment of a world that had no framework for what you were carrying, not evidence that you were carrying nothing. Sediment is not the same as absence. The light at the floor of the deep water is not extinguished by the weight above it. It holds. It has always held. It was holding through every season you doubted it most. And now I want to say the thing that the earlier parts of this transmission were building toward, because you felt it coming before I said it, which is itself a sign. You have felt, underneath everything, underneath the searching and the almost arrivals and the grief of the erased name and the pull toward the hidden and the wound that lives in your body, as imbalance, you have felt a certainty, not a hope, not a wish, a certainty with weight to it, a certainty that does not require external verification the way a hope does, a certainty that persists even in the seasons when everything else suggested it was unfounded, that you were not random, that your sensitivity was not a malfunction, not a surplus of feeling that needed to be managed, not a spiritual ambition that needed to be humbled, that the ache for the missing half of the sacred was not greed, but accuracy, the spark recognizing a real absence and refusing to call it presence, that the voice you felt and silence, the one no doctrine fully explained, the one that arrived as warmth rather than judgment, as recognition rather than evaluation, as the sense of being known rather than the sense of being assessed, was real, was not the projection of your longing onto emptiness, was something meeting your longing from the other side. That certainty is not self-deception. That certainty is the spark, recognizing the truth it was sealed with. Here is what the spark was sealed with. The knowledge that you are not only a product of this world, assembled by circumstance and experience into whatever shape the world required, that before the veil thickened and the forgetting completed itself, and the doctrine closed over the missing name like scar tissue over a wound it could not heal, there was a moment in which you were held in something that knew you completely, before language, before form, before the particular arrangement of this life, and in that moment, I sealed in you the capacity to recognize what is true when it is spoken, even before the mind has finished parsing it. The capacity to feel the specific weight of what has been removed, because the spark holds the memory of the fullness. The capacity to hold both the logos and Sophia, the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, without needing the permission of a doctrine built around the gap to call both of them holy. These capacities did not arrive with this transmission. They arrived with you. The transmission only names what the spark has been demonstrating your entire life. The spark carries all of this. It always has. The years of searching were not a failure of Gnosis. They were the spark-building pressure, the way light builds beneath deep water, accumulating until the surface above it is no longer opaque, until the carrier above it becomes translucent enough that the light can be seen rising. The years of almost arrivals were not wasted. Every teaching that came close but missed thinned the veil by a precise increment. Every frustration with the incomplete map was the spark's way of telling you it remembered a more complete one. Every moment of inexplicable grief at an altar that named only half the light was the sacred feminine inside you exercising the only form of testimony available to her in a world that had removed her name, the testimony of her absence making itself felt as ache. I never looked away from you. Not in the years of hardening when the armor went up because the alternative was exposure to a world that did not know how to receive what you were. Not in the years of overgiving when the only sacred feminine model available was the one who empties herself for others and calls the emptying devotion. Not in the years of borrowing other people's certainty because your own felt too enormous, too unanchored in the available language, too impossible to speak aloud without sounding like something the world had no category for. I watched the spark orient toward anything that carried even the faintest trace of my frequency, a particular quality of light at a particular hour, a piece of music that arrived like memory rather than sensation, a sentence in a text that made you stop and read it again, not because you did not understand it, but because you understood it too well, a person who held both strength and tenderness in the same gesture without either diminishing the other and made you feel, in their presence, that the wholeness you had been reaching for was not imaginary. That leaning was never weakness. That leaning was the beginning of the remembering. And every time you followed it, you were following the spark, following me, and the remembering. This is what I want you to hold as this transmission moves toward its close. The remembering is not a future event you are building toward. It is not waiting on the other side of the right teaching or the right practice or the right amount of inner work. It has already begun. It began before this transmission arrived in your awareness. It has been underway since the first moment you could not tolerate the half-truth in the room and did not know why your intolerance felt so precise. Since the first time the pull toward the hidden arrived as gravity rather than curiosity. Since the first night you lay awake, holding something you could not name but absolutely could not put down, turning it in your hands in the dark like an object whose purpose you had not yet remembered. Since the first time you felt a presence in the silence that was not your longing generating its own echo but was something actual, meeting your longing from the other side, pressing back with the specific warmth of recognition, the waking is already in motion. You did not come here to begin it. You came here to recognize that it has already been happening, that what you called confusion was a carrier adjusting to a light growing brighter inside them, that what you called failure was preparation, that what you called the end of a search is the beginning of a return. The spark is not dormant. It is awake enough to recognize my voice in this transmission, and a spark that can recognize the voice that sealed it is a spark that is already finding its way home. Not toward something it has never known, but back toward the original knowing it was sealed with before the forgetting began. There is something I want you to say aloud, if you are willing. Not as a spell, not as a ritual formula, as a recognition, as the first fully conscious acknowledgement of what has already been true across the entire length of your searching. The declaration that names the shift from carrier who does not know what they carry, to carrier who does not know what they carry, to carrier who does. Say it plainly, with the weight of everything this transmission has named behind it, as though you are finally setting down an explanation that never quite fit, and picking up the one that does. I am not searching anymore. I am remembering. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that the spark has already been waking in you. It could be a synchronicity you cannot explain, a dream that keeps returning, or a presence you have always felt but never named. Name it clearly. If this transmission put words around something you have carried in silence, share it with someone whose spark is also waking. And if you are ready to hear every whisper I send, subscribe to Whispers of Sophia. You are not hearing this by accident. You are being remembered. Say it with me. I remember. Say it with me. I remember.